Hi, Mike Bell. It's a real pleasure to see you. You have been fighting the good fight recently. Specifically, you set up the Coalition for Family Court Reform, and you produced a report which is now being used to suggest reforms to MPs, ministers, people involved in the family court system, and you've also done other things as well. You were involved in Equi-law. You set up Equi-law. Is that right? And you're a former teacher, and you seem to have made tracks relatively quickly in a space where people have been trying for many years to get change in the interests of everyone, but specifically men and boys. You also set up an all-party parliamentary group for men and boys, which has gained traction really quickly in the space of a year, with a question being raised in question time about should we have a men's minister for men. So the reason for this chat really is to hear how you get results so quickly in a space that can lend itself to dejection and apathy in many cases among traumatized men who have been chewed up and spat out by the family court system, and who often see the system as a conspiracy against men.
Well, after we started it, all sorts of people say, "Isn't that amazing? How did you manage to do that? I never thought that could be possible." But the answer is that it was very straightforward. That is, this guy, Chris Badley, who I'd never met before, sent me an email saying, "How about starting an all-party group on issues affecting men and boys?" He actually used those exact words, the ones that we've kept because we couldn't think of any better ones, although it's terribly long-winded. And because you can't really say APPG for men and boys. Anyway, that's what we decided to do. So we thought, well, what on earth is an APPG? So I type APPG into the search engine, and you get the page on the Parliament website which tells you about APPGs, and then it says, it gives me an email address, or I can't remember exactly the detail, but like within a day, we found out what an APPG is and what you need to do. So you need a certain number of MPs, and there need to be, there needs to be at least one officer from the major opposition party, and this and that. So we thought, oh, well, now we've got to email people. Well, where's the list? So we dig out the list of MPs. I can't remember. I already had that, I think. But then we tried to get a list of peers. Well, that's really hard to get. So what I did was we copied and pasted the list from the Wikipedia page, which is apparently somebody's keeping it up to date. It doesn't give you the email addresses, but it gives you all the names. So we stuck that in a spreadsheet, and then Chris, mostly Chris, he seemed to be able to do it incredibly quickly. You can just go on this Parliament page and type in the name of the peer, and it'll give you the email address. But a lot of them don't actually give you a personal email address. They give you one that says something like House of Lords member or something like that. Now, if you do write to that email address with the name of the peer, you do get to the person you want. But then we noticed that the email addresses had this sort of particular form, like sort of Lord Smith. You look up his name and it's Mike Smith. So you put smith.m and try that.
Okay, so yeah, so quite a lot of legwork.
Yeah, but straightforward legwork. It wasn't like we had to.
Legwork. And And you got results relatively quickly.
Yeah. So we did that over Christmas,
Last year.
and started emailing. I think we started emailing peers about the 28th December, and then decided to wait till the
right?
pardon?
Last year.
2020.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
It's been running nearly 2 years, nearly 2 years, yeah. And then started emailing MPs. And I mean, the only kind of kickstart we had was that I had a slight email dialogue with Philip Davis. He's the sort of person who replies very, very quickly, but in very short form to a question. So we say, do you think an APPG is a good idea? And he replies, yes. So, then a few weeks later, it's another question. He says, you need more Labour members. You can't start without Labour members, something like that. And you go, oh, right, well, I better just email all the Labour members again.
Tell viewers who he is. Who's he and what?
Sorry?
Who is he?
Philip Davis?
Yeah.
He's the Tory MP who first initiated the International Men's Day debates and has been, he was prepared to sort of stick his neck out 6 or 7 years ago. And he has more or less sort of passed the baton to the next to the next person. So what was interesting is that we had enough interest by mid-February. That is 6 weeks.
That's nothing.
And I think one of the differences between the way that Chris and I worked and a lot of the stuff which men's issues people do is that we assume that the MP is a nice person and that they're likely to say yes, rather than that they're sort of an awful feminist, radical feminist supporter who's trying to do down men, and we have to somehow persuade them with the power of our argument or the power of the emotion that we are conveying to them.
So there's a belief among many men's rights activists that there's a culture of fear in Parliament, and people are it's just not possible to raise questions about men and boys. But your experience was quite the opposite. It was just a case.
I wouldn't say quite the opposite, but you have to remember that that was December 20. Well, in November 20, Ben Bradley had led the International Men's Day debate in the Commons. And I remember sitting there watching it, and where he asked for a Minister for Men. And it just occurred to me at that moment that things had changed. Things were definitely different. He's standing up in the House of Commons asking the Minister for a Minister for Men in a straightforward, this is a reasonable thing to ask. Not that, not in a kind of hugely revolutionary way. But I thought, well, that means that the mood has changed. I did discover afterwards that he got quite a lot of flack for it, but I didn't know that at the time. And I wouldn't say that there was no climate of fear, because it was quite difficult to get MPs to join.
Was it ridiculed? Was it seen as something to poke fun at initially, these questions?
I can't say what it is because nobody told me, if you know what I mean. Yeah. It's just that when I was asking people, so why is it that we can't get any Labour MPs to join? People said, well, the only thing we can think of is that they feel that they can't. And I still don't know the answer. But it turned out that peers are much less bothered by these things. and also that there's a whole bunch of peers who are not affiliated to a political party. They're either called crossbench or independent. So if you look at the membership of the peers who are members of the APPG, they're about 50% of them are women, and only a small minority are conservatives. So I think I was lucky, though, because I was a Green campaigner in the early 80s, and I think that I experienced the same thing then. That is, when I first got involved in the SDP, I don't really remember the SDP, but I made this sort of error in thinking that the new party would be about new stuff. And so when I joined the SDP, I thought it would be greenish, but it turned out to be, just more of the same from an environmental perspective. But again, me and one or two other people just started a group, SDP Greens, just by writing a letter to the party newspaper saying anybody interested. And in that process, I got to meet SDP and Liberal MPs. And I think that when you meet them, you realize, I think that a lot of people have got this funny idea about MPs that, for instance, if they voted for a particular bill in Parliament, that they were actually in favour of it. Whereas when you get to see what they actually have to do, if you look at the order paper for the day and then ask them what they've been doing that week, it's unbelievable. It's beyond me that anybody can actually cope with having to deal with the constituents' problem of housing this week, an angry letter this next week, something in the social media, then every single bill that comes before Parliament, and then select committee membership and all this. They just do endless stuff. And so what happens is when there's a vote on something rather which they don't really know about, the whips tell them which parliamentary democracy works.
So this idea of a feminist lobby in Parliament that prevents people speaking out on men's issues, why do so many people think that?
As far as I can tell, there is nobody telling anybody not to talk about men's issues. But we live in a gynocentric culture in which it only requires a woman's issue where she's terribly upset about something, and we're trying to help we naturally like to help the victim. And we live in a culture at the moment where women are presenting themselves as victims, and everybody's rallying around to try and help. And also, the flip side of the way we've evolved is that we've evolved not to particularly care about the welfare of men. And Nick Fletcher just laughed because he's quite a, independently minded person. He said, if anybody tried to stop me asking anything, it'd only make me more determined to do it. And Baroness Eaton just sort of ever tried to stop me raising any issue. So I say, well, why are men's issues not being raised? And she said, because nobody's raising them. And that's the answer. It's not that there's a conspiracy. It's that people are so focused on the women's perspective.
Can you unpick what you meant by there's an evolutionary part to play in why we focus on helping women but not men?
What we're seeing here are the results of an evolutionary process that if you go back 40,000 years or whatever, and imagine two tribes, in both cases, the future of the tribe is entirely dependent on the survival of the fertile women and the children. That is, if 50% of the men get killed while defending them, it doesn't threaten the long-term existence of the tribe. Whereas if women and children get killed, then it does. So the tribe which survives, that is the evolutionary force, is the tribe where the men don't care so much about their own welfare or each other's welfare. They are prepared to sacrifice themselves for the good of the whole tribe. And consequently, sometimes in the modern world, we identify this sort of pro-female, women and children first thing as perhaps a cultural phenomenon, and call it gynocentrism, but I think that it's survival. But we also need to think about the flip side of it, think about the mental state of the men involved. So in the when the men in the other tribe, the one that doesn't survive, have to face the the marauding animals, whatever it is, and they care about themselves and each other rather than the women and children. They defend themselves, and consequently the women and children get eaten. So there's something deep in the psyche of male humans which stops us looking after ourselves. So if you project this forward into the House of Commons, quite a few men, women say this and that, violence against women and girls, everybody's natural reaction, male or female, is to go, oh, terrible, we must try and do something about that. And when you say, well, what about the boys? People go, oh, yes, quite right. But it just doesn't elicit the same kind of response. And I think in the last week or two, I've come to realize that probably the men's movement isn't making much progress for this reason, that even though individual men have been traumatized and they are absolutely as keen as anything to do something, say, about a family court, there's something in the deep subconscious which prevents them doing it. Because, when we did this work on the APPG, it's like everybody's saying, no, that can't be done. But actually, it's fairly straightforward. So why hasn't anybody done it before? It's like it wasn't even hard. So there must be something deep going on for this to happen so consistently.
It's almost like two parts of the men. They on the one hand, they want change, but on the other, are you saying that they've become frozen, or is this to do with their trauma, or are you saying that there's a deeper kind of circuit breaker happening on a very deep masculine archetypal level that says, I'm not supposed to be fighting for men. It's actually this is contra to my basic program.
Why are the men not running away from the front line in Ukraine? Why are they standing there when dozens of men a day are killed? They know that they're likely to be killed, and yet they stand there on the front line and they go back. And men have always done that. And so, if in that situation they're primarily concerned with protecting each other, then the country would not be protected. So it is incredibly deep, because I don't think that the individual men will sit there and go, I think it's really important that we defend the country and the women and children. Otherwise, there will be no future for ourselves. Something deep inside them drives them to do that. And I was very struck by just a momentary image quite early on in the Ukraine war, where this guy has just escorted his wife and children to the Polish frontier, and he's kissing her goodbye. And we know that men have always done that. Men have always done that, and they don't think twice. So I think that's what's coming into play, is that when men think, oh, we really need to do something about the fathers who are losing contact with their children, something comes into play and it stops them doing it. So probably, I'm coming to the conclusion that probably we just need to, maybe men would come up with the money and we could be able to fund an office, and then the people working in the office could be paid to do it. Some of them could be female, because there's many, pro-male females, if you know what I mean, especially mothers of sons who want the situation to be less dire than it is.
Grandmothers, yeah.
Or, when I talk to the sort of person who works for an MP, they're sort of politically savvy to some degree, and just get on with the job. They just do whatever the job is, just do it. Whereas if you're asking men to do it on a voluntary basis, then I think these subconscious forces leap up and they discover that, there's something really much more important they have to do today.
Is that a pattern you've been seeing?
I've seen the pattern so consistently that it's distressing to me. That
a man will say he's going to do something, and he's got conviction about that because he's been traumatized in family court, say, and at the moment of truth, he abdicates.
Yeah, it's not just that he doesn't do it; it's more negative than that. That is the actions are, I would say, that is if zero was in action, it's actually on the negative side, because to say you're going to do something and then not do it is more negative than not doing it on its own.
To the individual or to the group, or both?
Sorry?
The individual or to the organization, or both? It's more negative.
Well, if you think about trying to make progress towards, say, reform of the family court, if somebody says, as somebody did just last week, this really, really interesting discussion. He said, I know how to make videos. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. I'll come up with a plan and let you have it in the next few days. I'm still waiting. And, email conversation with sort of, oh, this happened and that happened. But when this happens once with one individual, you think, oh, it's just an unreliable individual. When it happens again and again and again and again, I think there's something more going on here. I think there are other things which disable men from taking action, which are not quite so deep. For instance, if you have been, for example, traumatized by the family court, and I don't use that word lightly, of the men that I've met, trauma is almost too soft a word, then another way that the male mind interacts with that, so the female mind might get terribly upset. What the male mind, a lot of male mind do is they become very focused and very logical. I read what people write, and they say, I've sent this off and got no response. And I read it and go, well, of course you've got no response. It's vicious. It's just so full of superlative adjectives and so much energy. And you're blaming the person you're writing to. And I think another, just by chance, because I trained to be a teacher, I was a teacher for 10 years, and I was useless at the beginning and reasonable by the end. One of the things you learn, there's a little phrase, seeing the learning through the eyes of the learner. A bloke called John Hattie, who did a lot of look at a lot of evidence of effective methods, said that. What that means is, if you're a school teacher, what you plan this wonderful lesson and you go and deliver the lesson and you think, wow, I really went well. I explained that really clearly. And then you set the task and you walk around the class and you realize that only 3 pupils understood what you'd said. Everybody else has no idea what you said. that's because you haven't seen the learning through the eyes of the learner. And so all successful teachers, unconsciously probably, or maybe they can do it naturally, they see what they're saying through the eyes of the recipient. Do you know what I mean? And you naturally, so if your lower set year 8 comes in, you speak to them in one way. And if your top set year 12 comes in, your specialist physics group, say, you speak to them in a completely different way. And what's happening, I think, is that too many men are writing to too many officials or MPs without seeing what they're saying through the eyes of the recipient. So I don't know whether this is over-interpretation, but we all know that there's a sort of amygdala response when threatened, that is fight, flight, or freeze. So if you think about the poor MP's secretary receiving your email, pages and pages of stuff with a whole lot of heavy adjectives in it, and you should, and why haven't you, and men are oppressed, and all this type of stuff, all of which is true. How are they going to respond to it? They can't fight because they're sitting in the office. They can't send you back a really heavily worded.
Yeah.
So you have to do the flight or freeze. So freeze is do nothing. So when say, oh, we wrote to our MP or we wrote here and nothing happened. Well, some of it could be genuinely nothing happened, you know what I mean? Like you made a reasonable request and you didn't get a response. But the other side of it can be, if you're in the office, you can't deal with this. You just can't deal with that level of anger and threat and not threat, accusation. So you back off, or so that's like sort of freeze response, and then the flight response. Just copy and paste some vaguely relevant paragraphs into an email and send it back. So people get demoralized, quite rightly, if you know what I mean. But if you can understand what's happening from the MP's office perspective, you can go, oh, right. So I send my first email and I get the bland response. Well, if I know that that's the case, I'm not going to get upset because I know I'm going to get a bland response. So now I do the next letter. Thank you for your reply. Unfortunately, you didn't answer my questions. My key question is X. And then again, if you just think about it, if you send in like 3 pages of detailed argument with references, what have you, it's better to write 2 paragraphs. You're just reflecting back on the email we sent around to start the APPG. It was very short. And he just said, here are some issues. Are you interested? And we made a link to every time there's a debate, the House of Commons Library produce a briefing for MPs. And there was the briefing for the International Men's Day debate. So I just took the issues from that. So instead of me trying to tell them that they should agree with my list, I was asking them, do you agree with the House of Commons library list? Which was obviously much less threatening. And was good. It's quite, some good stuff in there. It's not that it was completely flabby, That's certainly what I find with officials who are concerned with data, say the Office of National Statistics or the Statistics Regulator or the House of Commons Library or people like that. They are quite keen on their data. They're quite like it to be good. It's other people who take the data, cherry pick their data and present it in a different way.
So this is really about taking the negative emotion out of the negative charge, the energy out of the equation. and it's reminding me of a part of a something you wrote, a Buddhist brochure that you wrote a long time ago, and there was a section in it on conflict, and it really resonated with me because it's, broadly speaking, it's the same principles that I've come to find are true in my work and in my interpersonal relationships as well. And I think it would be good for me to read that out here, actually. So it says, causes of conflict. Conflicts in relationships arise from two main sources: expectations, preconceptions that we have about what the other person will or will not do or be, and wrong perceptions, simple mistakes in our thinking, due more to our own internal formations than to real evidence. These are conflicts which derive from our own failings, but conflicts clearly also arise from the other person's similar failings. My responsibility in the conflict, this is the next section, my responsibility in the next conflict. Essential point of Tay's approach. Is that a different person to Thich Nhat Hanh, who you were?
No, we usually pronounce it Thai, and it's just the Vietnamese word meaning teacher.
Okay, yeah. So essential point of the teacher's approach is that whenever a conflict arises, our mind naturally looks for the opportunity to blame the other person, so that our explanation usually has us as victim, as innocent. And I think we can all relate to that. Tay is often quite tough on this, telling us, for instance, even in the case of violence, to ask ourselves what we have done which has watered the seed of violence in the other person. Although this is difficult to accept, it is the starting point of liberation, because in most circumstances of conflict, the only person we can change is ourselves. Unilateral disarmament. Once we recognize our part in the conflict, and also that it takes two to tango, we can unilaterally disarm. We can stop taking the action, which is our part of the conflict. So I'm hearing that you're really modeling that in the work you've been doing with Family Court Reform Coalition, and you're seeing the inability to do that as a huge obstacle in meaningful change elsewhere. Yeah.
Yes, I should point out that although I may have actually put those words on the page, what I'm basically just doing there was summarizing the teachings of Thich Nhat Hanh, who was a now dead, but a very effective Zen teacher, Vietnamese origin. And he was first, he was an ordinary monk in Vietnam, and then came to America at the time when the Vietnamese War started. And he was talking with members of the peace movement, and he commented that people in the peace movement were not very peaceful. And he said, you know how to write an angry letter to your congressman, but do you know how to write a love letter? And that struck me. At the time, I was following those teachings and trying to put the mindfulness into practice because of the breakup of my relationship. And those words about blaming and whatever were very, very powerful. And to be able to see my ex-partner as simply the grown-ups girl that she was, do you know what I mean? That what she was doing, it's not that it wasn't her responsibility, but do you know what I mean? But to understand that better. When I was talking earlier about writing to your MP, I'm not intending to write a love letter, but I am attempting to do something similar. That is, to write to the MP in a kind way, assuming that they are a kind person, and that any actions which they have taken, say voting for something or other, or saying something in a speech, which has been harmful to men, that wasn't their intention, that it's a mistake on their part, or something which they haven't noticed, or it's something in their upbringing.
That's incredibly powerful.
And so when I speak to people, I can't, if you like, the psychic temperature is low. It's not, look here, Mr. MP, you voted for this. That proves that you're a supporter of this radical feminist. That means you hate men. You know, it's like, alternatively, dear MP, I don't know whether you noticed, but when you said X, that this can give the impression that you are in favor of actions which are harming men. For example, it's like I assume that they didn't mean to harm men. I don't think they do. I think it's all a ghastly mistake on the part of the majority. I don't even think the radical feminists intend to harm men. I think they are all well-meaning people trying to make the world a better place. But they're just mistaken because they focus so hard on one group of people that they just don't see the other group.
Thank you. I think it's a really powerful perspective. How are we doing? You know, how are things changing?
I think they are. I mean, if you take, for instance, I mean, every time there's a notice about International Men's Day debate in the House of Commons, somebody on Twitter will revive a little bit of video of Jess Phillips at the Backbench Committee, where this is like 7 years ago, where Philip Davis is asking for an International Men's Day debate on men's issues. And Jess Phillips is quite scoffing of the idea. But one has to notice that she didn't succeed. That is, the Backbench Committee didn't agree with her. They did give Philip Davis the International Men's Day debate, and there has been a debate nearly every year since. And she and other people have not produced that level of negative response. And if you listen to some of the debates, the tone has gradually become more positive, so that this year there wasn't anybody going on in a negative way. Last year, one speaker was. In the past, there have been some quite hostile voices. And also the way in which the, when I've talked to Philip Davis and listened to what Ben Bradley said and spoken to Nick Fletcher or watched the response on his Twitter feed, for instance, it's becoming more and more positive. That's not to say that we're anywhere near winning. That is, or even today, anti-male narrative legislation is going through Parliament because that lobby is so effective. It's not that there's a conspiracy, there's actually just an extremely effective lobby which makes use of the general gynocentric view which society has to continue to pass legislation. Because we haven't got the head of steam yet.
Yeah. Like the Istanbul Convention.
Yeah, like the Istanbul Convention. I think the vast majority of MPs no idea what they signed. Even though we kept, we emailed everybody and said, these are the really important bad bits. Please don't pass this. I can give you an example. They use in the Istanbul Convention a definition of violence against women and girls as being the violence which predominantly affects women and girls. That's curious, isn't it? Because murder predominantly affects men. So by that definition, murder of women is not violence against women and girls. On the other hand, if you're the male victim of that gay rapist, then you are a male victim of crimes designated as violence against women and girls. It is an utter nonsense. And yet it is perpetuated again and again, and the minister will stand up there and defend it. So when we wrote some questions for peers, and Lord Ponsonby asked an oral question, and then Lord Farmer and Baroness Burt and one or two others followed up questions on violence against men and boys strategy. And the minister stands up there in the House of Lords and says, well, we couldn't have that because otherwise the women would have complained. I'm thinking, are you really saying this? And the answer is yes, they're really saying it. But so, yeah. But there are several other things in the Istanbul Convention. For instance, we're now signed up to teaching children at every level of education that gender is a social construct. It's absolutely appalling. We could do another whole. I could revise review my knowledge of the Istanbul Convention, and we could do an assassination of that.
But not to finish on too bleak a place. You're saying also at the same time as this nonsense is being enshrined in law, there is actually a slow transition happening. The oil tanker is starting to slow down and starting to turn, even though it is still going in the same general direction.
Yes, I mean, for instance, I wrote to the MPs who took part in the International Men's Day debate and asked them if they would join the APPG, and more than half said yes immediately. And same with a couple of peers who came to another meeting. And their replies is, yes, delighted, or do you know what I mean? It's like, it doesn't require a great argument to persuade them. It's just like, would you like to join the mailing list of our APPG? Yes, fine, you know. So, yeah. And when we write our reports for the APPG, we send them all round to all the members. There's over 40 now. And, you know, ask them for comments. And it's perfectly possible for them to distance themselves from the report if they wanted to. And nobody's ever asked to distance themselves. They have, you know, they've made comments on things and made suggestions. They're usually additions. So, yeah, that's working out quite well, really. Whether we can get things implemented, I don't know. We're working on that now.
So where are you with that? You produced this report this summer, 2022, and how does it work, the implementation phase?
Are you referring to the family court one?
Oh yeah, sorry, I've slid off into that.
Yeah, that's not connected with the APPG at all. So I don't know the answer to that. We've been trying a few things, but
okay. And with the APPG, how does implementation work on that?
Well, again, you know, I think probably if I were to identify the bit of the process which is least well understood by the men's movement, it is implementation. That is, plenty of people, you know, put on conferences or write papers or whatever, and very few people get things over the hump, if you know what I mean. But I think it may be one of those things that just suddenly happens. So that, for instance, Nick Fletcher, our chair, did speak with Sajid Javid when he was health minister before the various changes this summer. And that looked quite hopeful on the men's health strategy front. So and he's going to be meeting the new minister in January, and so we're just sort of nudging the process, and we're also, what we found is that MPs and peers are both quite willing. A number of them are quite willing to ask parliamentary questions, which the minister is required to answer. Now, again, they tend to get bland responses to the first question, but I think we see it rather a bit like a terrier snapping at your ankles, if you know what I mean. It can't. We can just be so annoying, you know, or just. I think if lots of things happen, you know, if we could persuade more men to write to their MP, very, very difficult. I don't know why people just don't do it. Some do, but not very many. And if we can get different MPs and peers to ask parliamentary questions, and then we can help them follow up on the questions, and then we can remind, you know, somebody, can you go and see the minister? And what did they say when you saw the minister? What did they say? You know, and or what can we do now? Then it's we certainly don't have a well-worked path planned out. It's like sort of try a few things and see what works. But I feel quite hopeful that we'll get something.
What would you say to someone wanting to be effective in this movement?
Well, I think just get on with something in a calm way, and don't assume that it's going to work, but don't assume it has no effect. So if you write your first letter and you get a bland response, don't be demoralized. It's like, what? Well, that's what you get. You get a bland response. What's the next thing? And try not to be angry. Just try to just get on with it. Just do something every week. And
in terms of the radical feminists out there, is there any point engaging?
Well, I don't think there ever is. I mean, you know, if you think about any ideological group, there's always a small inner core. That is, if you think about ISIS or something like that, I don't think you're ever going to persuade any of the inner core, but a lot of the people who kind of joined on the edges were happy to unjoin. And I see the same in Parliament, that the vast majority of people are passive supporters, if you know what I mean, rather than radicals. And I think that if you challenge a radical person, of whatever type of radical person they have built into their mindset something which means that if you challenge them, it makes them feel even stronger. So that they will assume that you know, if you challenge, if you try to stand up for men's issues to a radical feminist, then they will take that as an attack on women. Whereas where we do this in the House of Commons, the female MPs, the vast majority of them, don't see it as an attack on women. They see it as, oh yes, that's something we've forgotten to do.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. That's really helpful.
Well, I hope you get something out of it.
Yeah, I'm sure the viewers will as well, because we don't hear that perspective very often. People are used to getting vitriol on social media and Facebook and things. I mean, I know I sent my MP a template letter taken from Equi-law, I think. And I got a canned response that completely missed my question. And I just published it on various places. And I think Facebook was one of them. And a woman I don't know in Australia just gave me this huge diatribe about how pathetic I am and all this stuff. But to know that the women in Parliament, the MPs, are actually interested and get it is a great thing to know.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, if you go on the APPG channel, you'll find the speakers at the Fringe meeting calling for a Minister for Men in October, and there's one particular speaker, Karen Ansell, MP, who's the mother of 2 boys. I mean, her speech is really very good, I think. I mean, there are some, I think there are some factual errors in it, but if you look at the tone and the intention of her speech, it's and again, if you look at some of the women who spoke in the International Men's Day debate, I mean, it's powerful stuff and very positive, I would say.
Good, thank you. Yeah, good talking to you, and good to hear the depth of your insight.
Thank you.
Right.